about libraries?
Because they have books in them. And we're, you know, books are disappearing. Young people don't read, and it's a tragedy because a book is the most direct experience because you're in control of how you process it. You can take your time, you can reread, you can get lost in thought, you can come back to it. It's not passive, it's active, and keeps the mind alive.
I'm Deborah Caldwell-Stone. I thought we'd start with some background information about the Children's Internet Protection Act, and by looking at its history, in fact. CIPA is just the end of a line of legislation passed by Congress to address concerns about children's access to sexually explicit content on the Internet. We began in the 1990s with the Communications Decency Act, which was a broad ban on indecent materials. And then that was followed by the Children's Online Protection Act, which was a ban on the commercial publication of harmful to minors materials. CDA and COPA were both challenged in the Supreme Court, and they were permanently enjoined by the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. And these two cases give us two principles to look at. One is that the First Amendment applies without restriction to all material published on or provided through the Internet, and that direct restrictions on constitutionally protected speech intended to protect children from obscene content are unlikely to be found constitutional if the laws operate to restrict adults' access to protected speech. Now, the Children's Internet Protection Act was proposed in the wake of these decisions and responds to these decisions. Unlike the CDA and COPA, CIPA does not put the government in the business of directly regulating speech. Instead, it places conditions on schools and libraries' use of federal funds intended to subsidize Internet connections by requiring schools and libraries to employ technology to prevent users' access to illegal content. In practical terms, libraries and schools who use E-rate discounts or LSTA grants must install and employ filtering software on their computers. No library or school is required to accept these funds, and a library can choose to forego these funds to maintain local control of their Internet use policy. However, if they do accept the money, it must certify every year that a technology protection measure is in use on its computers, and the technology protection measure has to block access to certain visual images on the Internet. For adults, the filter must block access to visual images that are obscene or child pornography. And for minors under 17, the filter must prevent access to visual images that are obscene, child pornography, or what's called harmful to minors, that is, sexually themed materials that adults have a legal right to access but are deemed to lack any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. CIPA does permit any person authorized by the library or school to disable the filter or unblock a website for adult users to enable access for research or other lawful purposes. Note that the CIPA statute does not require that libraries filter text materials, controversial viewpoints or subjects, social media, or search engines. Nor does CIPA authorize or require tracking of users' web surfing habits. In fact, the law itself explicitly bars such tracking. Now, in 2001, the American Library Association and other civil liberties groups joined with library users to file a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Children's Internet Protection Act. After 3 years of litigation, a sharply divided Supreme Court issued a narrow plurality decision, with several justices writing opinions. The court as a whole upheld the Children's Internet Protection Act, holding that the First Amendment does not prohibit Congress from requiring public libraries as a condition of receiving federal funding to use a technology protection measure, a filtering software, to control what patrons and staff access online via library computers, as long as adults could request that the filters be disabled without needing to explain the request. Now, while the various opinions issued by the Supreme Court justices in the lawsuit offer different rationales for upholding the law, the one clear conclusion that can be drawn from all these opinions is that the ability of adult library users to gain access to constitutionally protected speech on the Internet is important to the constitutional use of Internet filters. Now, since the decision in U.S. v. ALA, there have been 3 lawsuits that have challenged a public library's implementation of CIPA. The first, Bradburn versus North Central Regional Library District, ended when the federal district court ruled that the library's policy was reasonable. And it ruled in part, they ruled it reasonable in part because the branch libraries were small and there was no separation between the adult areas of the library and the children's areas of the library. The second lawsuit, P. Flagg versus the Camdenton School District, found that it was unconstitutional for the school district to block access to content that was geared to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons and promoted gay rights while allowing access to anti-gay sites. In the final lawsuit, the library settled this lawsuit, but they agreed to a court order that barred them from unconstitutionally blocking access to websites that discussed minority religions like Wicca or paganism while allowing access to Christian-themed sites. Now, these three as-applied cases clearly indicate that while a library's filtering policy might be found to be reasonable, libraries do not enjoy unlimited discretion when filtering internet content. The Camdenton and Hunter cases in particular demonstrate that libraries cannot employ filters to engage in unconstitutional practices as viewpoint discrimination or the deliberate suppression of ideas. But the core fact remains that for the last decade, public schools and public libraries have been required to filter their users' internet access in order to obtain federal subsidies for their purchase of internet connections. There's clear evidence that libraries and schools are denying access to controversial topics and to social media sites under CIPA, so much so that the FCC has now included cautionary language in its last rulemaking informing schools and libraries that sites like Facebook should not be regarded as harmful to minors and should be allowed through the filter. All this gives rise to certain critiques and concerns that raise broad policy issues. First, CIPA, as a law, replaces places regulation of disfavored internet content in the hands of private actors, third-party vendors who sell or provide internet filtering software to libraries and schools. So it is vendors, not librarians or teachers, who make the decisions about what content is filtered. Librarians and teachers are displaced and deprived of their traditional professional roles by software and IT professionals charged with administering the filter. And this vendor's decision-making about what content to display and what content to censor is not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests or other transparency measures. There is no public accountability. Instead, the algorithms that make up a particular piece of software are treated as proprietary trade secrets. Vendors' decisions about what is filtered represents a form of speech regulation without any kind of meaningful check or balance. There's no due process available to challenge the filtering company's decisions, absent a lawsuit that targets the school or library itself that relies on the filtering software. The vendors' categories of content to be filtered is often subjective and reflects their personal biases and values. This is especially true of software marketed by companies and organizations with religious ties or explicitly religious missions. So the consequence is that schools and libraries often block much more content than CIPA requires. Now, CIPA also legitimizes filtering and censorship as a means of resolving the controversy over minors' access to sexually themed content, or anyone's access to content that is disfavored by the government. So it represents a kind of shifting norm that we're seeing. We're seeing more proposals to manage issues like hacking, copyright infringement, cybercrime, and more by simply denying users access via use of the technology. And even as the U.S. defends free internet freedoms for other countries, it is mandating that schools and libraries within its own borders use the same filtering software employed by repressive governments. And I find that this is generating a kind of disrespect for legal norms and ethical practices on the internet. Older youth openly seek to defeat school and library filters and often succeed. As a result, we're creating multiple generations of internet scofflaws. Now, CIPA is a legislative mandate that schools and libraries use software to undertake a task. CIPA represents a legislative mandate that asks software to do a task it cannot accomplish, distinguishing obscene images from other images. And none of the current methods used to filter content without human input, text or keyword analysis, link analysis, or IP address blockage, can filter without catching up large amounts of constitutionally protected content. So filtering software inevitably overblocks and underblocks constitutionally protected material, which is a violation of the First Amendment.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be with all of you. And it's really a great honor to be invited by the Edmonton Public Library. My dad sat on the board of our local library in New York for 25 years. It was at the end of our street, so it was like our living room. After school, me and my brothers would go there. It's why for years I spoke hardly above a whisper, because when I would go to the library, anytime I'd say something, the librarians would shush me. And so that's how I grew up. But not really, because I think librarians are the freedom fighters of our time. My brother David and I, one of the books that we wrote was called Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. And we have a chapter devoted to the librarians of Connecticut. Because, well, this past week is the 10th anniversary of President Bush signing the USA Patriot Act. And about 6 years ago, a librarian in Connecticut named George Christian, who was head of a nonprofit of a bunch of libraries, the internet system that interconnected them, was sitting in his office when 2 FBI agents came to the door. They knocked, he answered, and they said they needed to have information about people using the internet on a certain day at a certain time. And they handed him a document that was called an NSL, a National Security Letter. And he opened it, he read it. He looked up as it demanded this information. He said, I believe this is unconstitutional, and I won't be giving you this information. They looked at him pityingly like a predator sizing up his prey. They handed them their cards and said, you get back to us. He didn't know what to do, because when he read this letter, it said that he could not tell anyone about having received this. Now, this is a problem when you're the head of an organization. You're sort of accountable to people. If you tell anyone you've received a national security letter, and hundreds of thousands have been given out in the United States, perhaps more, you face up to 5 years in prison. Like, you can't tell your boss, you can't tell someone you work with, you can't tell your partner, you can tell no one. He didn't even know if he could tell his lawyer. So he called a meeting of the chair of the board of his organization, the library organization. And one of the people he called had just been asked to be on this. It was a voluntary board, and they had said to him, please serve for a year, we'll call you vice president, and it will just help us a lot. You'll have nothing to do. And before he knew it, he and other members of this board were being called, told not to tell anyone where they were going. They were to have a meeting with George Christian, and they raced to his office. He closed the door. They had a lawyer there, and he revealed to them the NSL, which made them all radioactive, because anyone who saw it could then not reveal information that they had. The lawyer took off. She said this was way beyond her pay scale, and that they'd have to call the American Civil Liberties Union. And they did, and they sued the US government. And they tried to use this opportunity as a way to take down the USA Patriot Act. It was an astonishing story. They could not be named. They were John Doe versus the US government trying to take down the USA Patriot Act. And one day, when one of the members of this board was coming home, somehow the US government had released their names at some point in the court documents, even when they're trying to be in control, there are mistakes made. And so the New York Times and other news organizations called one of the members' homes, and their high school son answered. So when he got home, his son came out because they had said something about a court case. His father was under investigation. And he said, "Dad, the newspapers have called. They want to know." He said, "You did not hear anything about that call. I don't want you ever to repeat it again." And he looks at his father and he says, "Dad, are you involved with drugs?" Well, they may not have succeeded in taking down the USA Patriot Act, but they did succeed in having the gag order lifted. And they were the first people in the United States able to talk about having received a national security letter. And they went on to talk about the dangers of the USA Patriot Act. The problem was during the whole period of the debate of instituting the USA Patriot Act, they were not able to speak because they were involved in this court case with the US government. These are very serious times when people are afraid of speaking out. I think libraries are all about open information, and that's what they were protecting. They said, "We're not here to surveil or to monitor the patrons of the library. We're here to get them information," which is why when I speak at libraries across the country, and you have the librarians on the side and all the students there with pierced noses and dreads and everything else, I said, "You guys have to understand, these are the ones that are taking the risk."
I'm not here as a taskmaster to tell you what to do, but we do have a job. If you're smart and you're cool and you're benevolent and you want to be a force for good, not only in your country but in the world, I think you're doing the right thing. You're inspiring young people to sit down and read a book. Yeah, they're young, they can do everything else, but when they come into your house, they're coming in to get better. They're coming in to improve their mind, because eventually they're voting. And think about this, when you see those obnoxious, very loud, and everyone at my age, everyone's not obnoxious and young, but when you see these loud, obnoxious young people, those ridiculous, stupid, bright red headphones with a skull on the side, and they're probably listening to some dire crap, MP3, whatever they're listening to, it's probably abhorrent and bad and pitch corrected. Do you realize that many of them will be able to vote in the next presidential election? That is really something to consider. A 10th or 11th grader could possibly be voting next time around. I take that very, very seriously. Like, boy, you better learn them up good, because when you give them that much leash to let them vote, that is huge. And you better teach them something. You better tell them that books are the way to go. You all are doing that. And so I basically came here to kneel in front of you and do this. Because the service that you all provide, it just can't be under-mentioned, or over-mentioned, rather. It's astonishing. And so I know that you deal with frustration. I know that whenever there's a cut to any kind of funding, libraries get it right in the kidney. I get it. I hope that you are not overly awed, and that you persevere through any of our country's wrinkles and folds as we keep evolving and getting up the road to our brighter, shinier, happier utopian future that I'm definitely knowing is going to happen. But you all are part of that, and I just wanted to come here today and remind you of that, because I don't know, you're so busy doing it. Those who do aren't always aware of what you do, like a fireman, like you're a hero. No, I'm not a fireman, do my thing. But what you do is heroic. Don't have time to think about it. And so what you do is heroic, and what you do is patriotic, and what you do is futuristic. You are shepherding and steering the very future of America. And that sounds kind of huge, but I'm right about that. I am right, and it's you. And that's why I'm in awe of standing in front of all of you today. Thank you, and have a wonderful convention. Good night.